Everyone, meet the ugly rat we're all stuck with now. That's what my daughter's husband said into the microphone at their wedding. He said it with a champagne flute raised high, cufflinks catching the chandelier light. 300 people in black tie laughing on cue like it was the funniest thing they'd heard all season. And my daughter, my Savannah, my girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder watching cooking shows on school nights, she giggled, covered her mouth with 2 fingers the way she always did when she was embarrassed. But she wasn't embarrassed for me. She was embarrassed by me. I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. It hurt the way only your own child can hurt you. Clean and deep, like a paper cut you don't notice until the lemon juice hits. I smiled because 3 days before that toast, I had signed the final set of paperwork. 51% of Whitfield Capital, Derek's fund, his legacy, the thing he introduced himself by at every dinner party, belonged to me. Not to Gloria Hargrove, the widow. Not to the school bookkeeper in her sensible shoes. It belonged to a network of 12 holding companies, quietly assembled over 7 years, all roads leading back to a woman sitting at a corner table in a ballroom she wasn't invited to stay in. Across the room, I watched Edward Whitfield set down his champagne glass. Derek's uncle, the man who had signed the capital agreement 18 months ago through an intermediary in Luxembourg. He looked at me, and the color left his face like water draining from a sink. He knew. He was the only one in that room who did. And that, more than anything, was the opening move. Not the paperwork. Not the fund. The moment when the most powerful man at that wedding looked at the woman everyone had dismissed and froze. The best kind of power is the kind no one sees coming. I want to tell you who I was before all of this. Not because I need your sympathy. I don't. But because you need to understand that I didn't start out strategic. I started out invisible. And there's a difference. For 30 years, I was a bookkeeper at a public school in Queens, New York. I wore the same 2 pairs of shoes until the soles wore thin. Then I had them resoled instead of replaced. I brought casseroles to potlucks. I balanced the PTA ledger down to the last 47 cents. I was the kind of woman people thanked by first name at retirement parties and forgot by the following spring. My husband Raymond was a good man. Kind, steady, the sort of man who fixed things around the house without being asked and remembered every anniversary without a reminder. He loved me, I'm certain of that. But he never believed I could read a balance sheet. He managed all of our finances. The retirement accounts, the investment portfolio, the insurance policies, the way men of his generation did. Quietly, confidently, without consultation. He'd bring documents home for me to sign, and I signed them. But before I signed anything, I read it. Every page, every footnote, every clause in language so dense it felt like a wall built specifically to keep people like me out. I read it anyway. I always had. When Raymond died of a stroke at 62, sudden, no warning, a Tuesday morning in February, people said, "Poor Gloria, she's alone now, she won't know what to do." What he left me, $180,000 in life insurance, a truck with 2 years left on the payments, and a handful of savings accounts he assumed would tide me over. What nobody knew, what Raymond himself never fully understood, was that while he played chess with our finances, I had been learning to read the entire board. The first year after he died, I was quiet. I grieved. I sat in rooms that felt too large and ate soup from cans and called Savannah too often. She was 23 then, already working in Manhattan, already gravitating toward the world that would eventually swallow her whole. But in that first year, I also started learning things I had no business learning, according to everyone around me. I took a continuing education course in real estate finance at Queens Community College. I was the oldest person in the room by 22 years. The instructor spoke to the younger students like they were obvious candidates for success, and spoke to me like I was a charming hobby horse. I took notes on everything he said, including the things he didn't say to me. I started small. $40,000 into a foreclosed commercial property in New Jersey, a squat little building on a dead-end street that nobody wanted because it backed up to a water treatment facility. I bought it because I had read 3 years of county rezoning proposals, and I understood, in a way the listing agent didn't bother to explain, that the area was going to be reclassified as light industrial within 5 years. It was reclassified in 4. I sold for $260,000. I didn't tell anyone. Not Savannah, not my sister in Ohio, not the women in my building who gathered in the lobby on Sunday mornings with their coffee and their opinions. I took the profit, folded it into an LLC I opened under a name that meant nothing to anyone, and started again. Year 3, 2 more properties. Year 5, a partial stake in a small manufacturing warehouse outside Newark, purchased through a second LLC. Year 7, 12 companies, a diversified portfolio of industrial and commercial real estate, a brokerage account that would have made Raymond's eyes go wide, and a reputation in certain very quiet financial circles as a careful, patient, and utterly anonymous operator. The money didn't change the way I lived. I still lived in my apartment in Harlem, still cooked my own meals, still wore sensible shoes, better quality now, but sensible. Because I had learned the single most important truth about money that most people never figure out. Money doesn't announce itself. Money whispers. And the people who learn to speak that language, the quiet language, the patient language, are the ones who eventually hold the room. I was holding it. Nobody knew. Savannah met Derek Whitfield during her second year of MBA school. She came home that Christmas with a new vocabulary, words like optics and narrative and vertical integration, and a way of looking at our apartment that I hadn't seen before. Not quite embarrassment. More like the particular discomfort of someone who has begun to outgrow a coat they still needed 2 winters ago. Derek was the kind of man who entered rooms like he'd already been applauded in them. White teeth, custom suits, a story that always started with when I was in Bali or when I was in Zurich, as though geography were a substitute for character. He shook my hand at our first meeting with the firm, confident grip of a man who has been taught that confidence is 9/10 of any negotiation. He looked at my apartment, my kitchen table, my framed photographs, my 30-year-old couch with the good throw pillow I'd bought to distract from the worn armrest, and I watched his eyes do that quick calculation that certain people can't hide. This is where she's from. And then, just as quickly, this is not where we're going. I smiled and offered him coffee. The changes in Savannah happened slowly, the way a photograph fades in sunlight. You don't notice it day by day. You notice it when you pick up the picture one afternoon and realize the colors are wrong. She stopped bringing her laundry home. She stopped calling on Sunday mornings the way she had every Sunday for 5 years. When she did call, it was usually to give instructions. "Mom, please don't bring up Dad in your speech. Derek's family doesn't know the situation, and it might make things awkward." Awkward. Like Raymond's death was a social liability rather than the thing that had quietly hollowed me out for 2 years. "Mom, can you maybe not wear anything too colorful to the rehearsal dinner? The photos will be very formal. Mom, you'll be more comfortable at the hotel near the airport. The estate is fully booked." I said, "Of course, sweetheart," every time. She said sweetheart back, the way you say it to a clerk who has bagged your groceries correctly. I noticed the specific flatness of it. I filed it away. The hotel near the airport was a chain with a breakfast buffet and a parking lot view. The Whitfield estate, where I could see from my window that at least a third of the guest rooms sat dark each night, had 14 bedrooms. I'd counted the windows. On the morning of the wedding, a florist's truck pulled into the estate's circular driveway and unloaded $9,000 worth of peonies. I know the amount because Savannah had mentioned the floral budget in passing, the way you mention a number when you've stopped being able to imagine how it sounds to someone else. I stood at my hotel window and watched the delivery, and thought about the roses I used to bring home from the deli on the corner after Savannah's piano recitals. Single stems, whatever was on the discount rack at the end of the week. She used to press them between the pages of her textbooks. She said I was the best mother in the world. She said it like she meant it. Children always do, right up until they don't. That evening, at the reception, Derek took the microphone for his toast. He was funny, I'll give him that. Timing, delivery, the practiced ease of a man who enjoys an audience. The ugly rat line landed exactly as he intended, a self-deprecating joke about difficult in-laws wrapped in enough charm that no one had to feel uncomfortable on my behalf. The laughter was warm, genuine, the kind you can't manufacture. Savannah giggled behind her hand. I smiled from the corner table, the one set for 6 that had 4 empty seats, because the friends I might have brought weren't on the approved guest list. I reached under the table and felt the quiet weight of my phone in my purse, where 2 hours earlier I had received the email confirmation from Patricia Oakes, my attorney. Subject line, ownership update. Finalized. Attachment. Board reassignment draft. I thought, let them laugh. Let them clink their crystal and signal for the next round of champagne and tell each other how delightful the peonies are. I sipped my water and watched the room and let them have their evening. It was the last easy evening they would have for quite some time. The morning after the wedding, I found the brunch invitation in the hotel trash can, still sealed. My name written on the envelope in Savannah's handwriting, the looping, optimistic cursive she'd developed in middle school and never fully grown out of. She had thrown it away before she'd given it to me, or someone had. Either possibility told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. In its place, a text from Derek's assistant, a woman I had never met and who had clearly never met me, informing me that transportation to JFK would depart at 10:15 and that alternate accommodations had been arranged for my remaining time. No brunch, no goodbye, just a car and a departure time. We're done with you. Not said, just implied, in the specific practiced language of people who have learned to dismiss others without ever technically being rude. I didn't respond to the text. Instead, I sat at the small desk by the hotel window with my laptop open and my coffee cooling beside me, and I reviewed the renovation permits for the townhouse in Brooklyn that Derek and Savannah had closed on 2 weeks before the wedding. 6 bedrooms, marble counters, a primary bath with heated floors that Savannah had photographed 17 times and posted with the caption, "Forever Home." The permits were already filed. The demolition team was already scheduled. 6:45 Monday morning. I had signed the authorization 3 days ago as the property's new owner of record. I approved the noise permits. I confirmed the crew. I closed the laptop. Then I called Patricia. "The final transfer," I said. "I want it done before they land from the honeymoon." "It's already processing," Patricia said. "You'll have controlling interest by Sunday night." "Good," I said. I looked out the window at the estate one more time, its windows golden in the early morning sun, its 14 bedrooms, its $9,000 worth of peonies wilting gently in the June heat. Then I finished my coffee, packed my bag, and took the car to JFK. At 11:42 that night, sitting in my own kitchen in Harlem with a cup of tea and the window open to the sound of the city, my phone lit up with the email. Ownership update. Finalized. Controlling interest confirmed. Whitfield Capital Holdings, 51.3%. I set the phone down on the table. Outside, a siren passed on the street below. Someone was laughing on the sidewalk. The city was doing what the city always does. Moving, indifferent, relentless, alive. I sat very still for a long time. They had booked me into a hotel by the airport. They had put the brunch invitation in the trash. They had laughed at the ugly rat in front of 300 people. They thought that was the end of something. It was the beginning. What none of them knew, what Derek had never bothered to find out, because men like Derek don't ask where quiet money comes from, was that Whitfield Capital had been dying 18 months before the wedding. 3 consecutive fund positions had collapsed. 2 key institutional investors had quietly withdrawn. Derek had expanded aggressively into a market sector that corrected sharply, and he'd done it with leverage he couldn't unwind fast enough. By the summer before the engagement, Whitfield Capital needed a capital infusion of at least $4 million, or it would be forced to dissolve. Derek didn't want to go public with the distress. Going public meant questions. Questions meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant the narrative he'd built, the self-made narrative, the visionary fund manager narrative, would develop cracks that no amount of PR could spackle over. So Edward, who was the actual financial architect of the Whitfield family's wealth, and who had been quietly cleaning up Derek's messes since Derek was 26, went looking for a silent investor. Someone with capital, patience, and no interest in headlines. He found one. Through a law firm in Luxembourg, through a blind intermediary, he connected with a holding entity called Hargrove Strategic Partners. The terms were unusual. No board seat, no public acknowledgement, no name on any prospectus or investor document. In exchange, a convertible note with a right of first refusal on equity conversion at a fixed valuation cap, exercisable within 36 months at the investor's sole discretion. Derek's lawyer reviewed the agreement. He was a corporate attorney Derek had hired because he'd gone to Yale and had good hair. He flagged nothing. He said the terms were aggressive but manageable. Derek signed. He never asked who Hargrove Strategic Partners was. He didn't think it mattered. It mattered. The fund stabilized. Derek reinvested. By the following spring, Whitfield Capital had recovered to a valuation 3 times its distress point floor. The convertible note at the fixed cap now represented when exercised, a 51% controlling stake. I exercised it 3 days before the wedding. I had been watching the valuation for 14 months, waiting for exactly the right moment. Not because I was planning what came next with Derek. I had no idea, at the time of the investment, that the man dying to bring into the family was the same man I was quietly positioning myself to control. The investment was made on fundamentals. The irony was purely structural. But when I understood what was happening, when Savannah first mentioned Derek's last name and something in my memory shifted and I pulled up the original term sheet and saw the name of the fund and sat very still for a long moment at my kitchen table. I made a decision. I said nothing. I waited. And when Derek Whitfield raised a champagne flute and called me a rat in front of 300 people, I was already the majority shareholder of every dollar he thought he owned. Edward came to me 2 days after the wedding. No call ahead. No assistant. He showed up at my building in Harlem carrying a deli coffee in a paper bag like a neighbor stopping by. Not a man whose family's financial future had just shifted underneath him like a fault line. I let him in. We sat at my kitchen table, the Formica one with the chip on the right corner that Raymond had always meant to fix and never did. Edward didn't comment on the apartment. He was smart enough for that. He said, "I didn't know it was you." I drank my tea and waited. He told me what I already knew. The Luxembourg intermediary, the capital agreement, the way Derek had signed without reading. He said he'd agreed to the terms because they needed the money and the terms protected Derek's public image. And protecting Derek's public image was something Edward had been doing for the better part of a decade. Then he looked at me across the Formica table and he said, "You own us, don't you?" It wasn't really a question. I slid a folder across the table. Inside, a printed shareholder ledger, stamped and notarized. My name wasn't on it, but 12 company names were, and if you knew how to read the cross-references, and Edward did, all 12 roads led back to one address in Queens. He turned the pages slowly. His hands started to shake, not dramatically, just the small, controlled tremor of a man who is very good at keeping his composure and has just encountered something that tests that skill. "Gloria," he said, "if Derek finds out—" "He already has," I said. "He just hasn't understood it yet." Edward set the folder down. He looked out my window at the courtyard below. A tree, a fire escape, someone's laundry on a line. He was quiet for a while. Finally he said, "Why didn't you tell Savannah?" I looked at my tea. I told her in every way I had available. In every invitation she chose not to open. In every phone call she replaced with a text. In every time she said sweetheart like she was tipping a valet. I set the cup down. She didn't want the truth. She wanted the story he was telling her. I couldn't compete with that story. So I stopped trying. Edward stood. He was a tall man, and he moved carefully, the way large men sometimes do when they're trying not to take up too much space. At the door, he turned back. "For what it's worth," he said, "you were never a rat." I smiled. "Tell that to your nephew." He left. The door closed. The city went on outside my window, indifferent and alive. I finished my tea and opened my laptop. There was work to do. The video went viral on a Tuesday. Not because I leaked it. I want to be clear about that. I never needed to. The internet has its own appetite, and Derek had fed it something it couldn't resist. A man in a custom tuxedo, champagne raised, laughing at a woman who raised the child standing beside him. Someone from Derek's side posted it first. A groomsman, I later learned. He'd clipped it cleanly, added subtitles, overlaid it with trending audio. He thought it was funny. He thought Derek was funny. He thought 300 people laughing at the mother of the bride was the kind of content that plays well on a Saturday afternoon. He was right, but not in the way he imagined. By Tuesday morning, the clip had 400,000 views. By Tuesday evening, it had crossed 2 million. By Wednesday, it was on Twitter, Reddit, 3 different Facebook groups for women over 50, and a TikTok account dedicated to what the caption called men who married up and didn't know it. Savannah reposted it herself. That was her first mistake. Not the last, but the one that cost her the most. She added a caption she thought was clever. "Parents know when to retire. You're not the main character anymore." She thought it was a clapback. She thought she was being edgy, relatable, the kind of daughter-in-law who stands by her husband with good humor and a sharp tongue. She had 42,000 Instagram followers by then, and she knew how to play to them. She had miscalculated her audience. The replies came fast, and they came hard. "That's your mother, the woman who raised you. On her own, from what I can tell. Your husband called your mom a rat at your wedding and you reposted it? She looks like she built the floor you're standing on, honey. You might want to be careful. This isn't edgy. This is just sad. Someone found an old photograph of me. I don't know where. Some school board meeting from 2018. My hair pinned back, a clipboard in my hands, standing outside in the November cold. They placed it side by side with a photo of Savannah in her $18,000 wedding gown. The caption read, "From bookkeeper to backbone, y'all played the wrong one." That image was shared 400,000 times in 36 hours. I know because Patricia sent me the analytics report. She'd been monitoring the situation since the clip first surfaced. That's the kind of attorney Patricia is. Thorough, quiet, always 3 steps ahead of the people who think they're running things. Savannah locked her accounts by Wednesday afternoon. Then she unlocked them, posted an apology, and locked them again. The apology was addressed to her followers. Not to me. It was a joke taken out of context. Family dynamics are complicated. I love and respect both my mother and my husband. The comments on the apology were, if anything, less forgiving than the comments on the original post. Both my mother and my husband. She put them in the same sentence like they're equivalent. Complicated equals you laughed at your mom on camera, sweetie. The way she said both tells you everything about which one she actually respects. Derek tried damage control of his own. He gave a phone interview to a finance podcast, one of those shows with a host who laughs too easily and asks questions designed to make guests look good. He called the toast lighthearted family humor. He said the clip was missing context. He said the in-law relationship was a work in progress, like all meaningful relationships. The host laughed on cue. The internet did not. By Thursday, the story had been picked up by 2 mid-size financial news outlets, not because of the wedding toast itself, but because someone had started asking questions about Whitfield Capital, questions about its recent recovery, questions about its investor structure, questions about who, exactly, was holding the purse strings behind the fund's sudden stabilization 18 months prior. I watched all of it from my apartment. Laptop open on the kitchen table, phone on mute, a glass of wine I kept forgetting to drink. The city outside my window doing its usual indifferent, beautiful thing. I wasn't gloating. I want to be honest about that. There was no satisfaction in watching Savannah's apology get torn apart by strangers on the internet. She was still my daughter. That hadn't changed. The love hadn't changed. What had changed was my willingness to absorb consequences that weren't mine to carry. She had made her choices. Choices have weight. I had spent 30 years teaching her that. At the kitchen table, over homework, during the years when it was just the 2 of us and the rent was due, and I was resoling shoes instead of replacing them so she could take the piano lessons she wanted. She knew. On some level, she had always known. The weight was hers now. I froze the wire transfer on a Friday morning. Derek had requested the release of funds for his upcoming gala, the Whitfield Legacy Ball, as he'd renamed it, a black tie fundraising event meant to court new institutional investors and repair the public narrative that was beginning to fray at the edges. He needed the transfer cleared for venue deposits, catering, the gift packages for major donors, the lighting rig he'd insisted on for what his events coordinator called maximum visual impact. He submitted the request through standard channels. It landed in a queue that, as of 3 days prior, required sign-off from the controlling shareholder. I looked at the request for approximately 45 seconds. I clicked deny. An hour later, he submitted it again, routed through a different account manager. I watched the notification appear on my screen. I waited 20 minutes, then denied it again. His assistant called the account manager, who called the fund administrator, who called Patricia's office. Patricia's paralegal took a message and said someone would be in touch. Derek, from what Edward told me later, had screamed so loudly that the administrative staff on the floor below could hear him through the ceiling. He fired a junior account manager on the spot. He threatened legal action against the fund's own infrastructure, which is the financial equivalent of threatening to sue your own house. He had no idea who had denied the transfer. He assumed it was a technical error. Then he assumed it was internal sabotage. Then he assumed it was a compliance issue triggered by the recent press. He went through 4 different explanations before it occurred to him, or before someone finally had the courage to tell him, that the denial had come from above his level. "What do you mean above my level?" he reportedly said. "I run this fund." He did not run this fund. Not anymore. I let the 3rd request sit for 3 days. Not denied, not approved, just suspended in the queue like a held breath. I wanted him to feel the uncertainty, the particular discomfort of reaching for something you've always assumed was yours and finding your hand closing around empty air. On the fourth day, I made a small purchase, not flashy, not traceable on its face. A blind trust registered in Delaware acquired the townhouse in Brooklyn, the one with the marble counters and the heated bathroom floors and the 17 Instagram posts Savannah had captioned "Forever Home." The acquisition had been in process for 2 weeks, but the final recording happened quietly, on a Thursday, while Derek was on the phone with his PR firm discussing narrative repositioning. He didn't know. She didn't know. The demolition crew arrived Monday morning at 6:45, as scheduled. I watched the footage on my phone later that morning. Someone in the neighborhood had filmed it. Derek in a terry cloth robe, barefoot on the front steps, gesturing at a crew of 8 workers with the baffled authority of a man who has never before been told that his signature means nothing. The foreman was a compact, unflappable man named Gary, who had been in the business for 22 years and had seen every version of this particular conversation. He pointed to the permits posted on the temporary fencing. He pointed to the authorization documents on his clipboard. He said what he was legally required to say. This work has been authorized by the property owner of record. All permits are filed and approved. Derek said, "I am the property owner of record." Gary said, "No, sir, you're not. Not as of last Thursday." Derek called the police. 2 officers arrived, reviewed the paperwork, and explained with the particular patience of people who have better things to do that this was a civil matter he'd need to pursue through the courts or through the property management company listed on the permits. He called the property management company. They gave him the contact information for the trust's legal representative. He called the number. Voicemail. Patricia's voice, calm and professional. "You've reached the offices of Oaks & Associates. Please leave a detailed message and we'll return your call within 2 business days." He left 4 messages in 40 minutes. Patricia's paralegal logged each one. Savannah sat in the kitchen of the house that was no longer their house, according to the records that matter, with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, and mascara she hadn't bothered to apply yet. The walls vibrated with the percussion of demolition. Dust moved through the air like slow snow. She looked at the authorization document Derek had brought inside. She read the name at the bottom of the signatory line. She read it twice. Hargrove Property Trust. She sat very still for a long time. Then she stood up, put on her coat, and took the subway to Harlem. I saw her on the security camera before she knocked, standing on the front stoop of my building, shoulders forward, hands in her pockets, no makeup, hair in the loose, falling-apart bun she'd worn as a teenager during finals week, when she was too stressed to care about anything but the material in front of her. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically. She was still tall, still carried herself with the posture Derek had apparently encouraged her to cultivate. But something in the structure of her had compressed. Something load-bearing had shifted. I buzzed her in. She came up the stairs. She never took the elevator in this building, even as a child, because she'd once gotten stuck between floors for 20 minutes, and the memory had never fully left her. And when I opened the door, she didn't say hello. She didn't say Mom. She said, "Why are you doing this?" Not an accusation. Almost a genuine question. The kind of question you ask when you've run out of other frameworks. I stepped back to let her in and went to put the kettle on. The good tea, the loose-leaf Darjeeling I kept for occasions that required something better than ordinary. "I'm not doing anything," I said from the kitchen. "I'm just making a little noise." She sat down on the couch, slowly, carefully, the way you sit when you're not sure the furniture will hold. She looked around the apartment with the expression she'd worn since her 3rd year with Derek, the expression of someone who has trained themselves to see a place as insufficient and can't quite remember why they started doing that. "You still live here," she said. "Not cruel, just noting it. You own half of Manhattan's industrial space and you still live here." "I like it here," I said. I brought the tea and sat across from her in the armchair that had been Raymond's. She wrapped her hands around the mug, her hands, which looked like mine, which she had always hated knowing, and she looked at the floor. "It's been a really bad week," she said. "The internet, Derek's investors, the house." She swallowed. "We're under so much pressure right now." I didn't say anything. "That post I made," she said. "The caption. I wasn't thinking about how it would—" "You meant it," I said. She looked up. "You meant it when you posted it," I said. "You just didn't expect consequences." That's different from not meaning it. She looked away again, out the window. At the tree in the courtyard she used to climb the lower branches of when she was 7, before we decided she was old enough for the piano lessons that turned out to be the thing she was actually gifted at. You called me background noise, I said, in front of 3 million people. The silence in the apartment had a particular texture, not hostile, not comfortable, just honest. The kind of silence that accumulates in small spaces when 2 people have run out of performance. Then she did something I hadn't anticipated. She set down her mug. She looked at me directly, not sideways, not at the floor, but at my face, the way she used to when she was young enough to think eye contact with a parent was a form of safety rather than exposure. "Can we fix this?" she asked. And for a moment, just a moment, the length of a breath held and released. I saw her, the girl who used to press roses between the pages of her textbooks, who had called me from her first apartment at 2 in the morning because she'd heard a sound she didn't recognize and couldn't sleep, who had sat beside me at Raymond's funeral and held my hand without letting go for 3 hours. I saw her. She was still in there. She was asking me something real. But the woman sitting on my couch had thrown a sealed invitation into a hotel trash can, had posted "You're not the main character anymore" for 3 million strangers, had giggled, covered her mouth and giggled, while her husband called me a rat into a live microphone. She had chosen over and over, in small ways and large ones, for 2 years. Every choice had been a door closing. At some point you run out of doors. I stood up. I picked up my tea. I crossed to the front door and opened it. "I think you should go now," I said. She went. She didn't finish her tea. She didn't hug me. She walked down the hallway in the boots Derek had probably bought her, and I watched through the peephole as she stood at the elevator, pressed the button with a finger that trembled just slightly, and then pressed her knuckles against her mouth and held them there. The elevator came. The door closed. I stood at my own closed door for a long time. Then I went back to my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and began reviewing the file Patricia had prepared on the Whitfield Legacy Ball. There was still work to do. The ballroom was full by 8 o'clock. I know because Patricia had arranged for someone to send photographs, standard event documentation, nothing unusual. 300 guests in black tie, a stage with professional lighting, exactly the maximum visual impact Derek had specified. 4 members of the financial press with lanyards and cocktails. 2 local television cameras positioned near the stage entrance. Derek looked perfect. He always looked perfect. Navy tuxedo, single white pocket square, the particular ease of a man who has rehearsed confidence for so long it's become indistinguishable from the real thing. He moved through the room the way he always did, touching elbows, bending toward ears, laughing at precisely calibrated intervals. He took the stage at 8:45. I was sitting in my apartment in Harlem, laptop open, the event's live stream running in a small window in the corner of my screen. I had the fund's administrative dashboard open in the main window. My shoes were off. I had poured a glass of wine I was mostly ignoring. Derek spoke well. I'll give him that. He spoke about legacy, about vision, about the responsibility of capital in an uncertain world. He spoke about the Whitfield family's commitment to equity and impact investing. He was compelling in the way that certain people are compelling, not because of what they're saying, but because of how absolutely they believe you should be listening. Then he announced the donation. "Tonight," he said, the room leaning in, "Whitfield Capital is proud to pledge $1 million to the Global Equity Initiative." The flashbulbs went off. The applause was genuine. 300 people who had come specifically to be moved by a gesture like this, and who were, in fact, moved. Derek smiled his best smile and accepted a sleek card reader from his assistant for the ceremonial swipe, a piece of theater they'd clearly rehearsed, the wealthy man making his wealth visible and generous at the same moment. He swiped the corporate card. The reader beeped. Declined. A small laugh from Derek. Controlled. Practiced. A technical glitch. He tried again. Declined. The laugh didn't come this time. He tried a second card. Declined. A third. Declined. The room changed in the space of 4 seconds. Not loudly. There was no gasp, no dramatic shift. It was more like a pressure change, the way the air feels different before a storm, when something in the atmosphere has shifted before the rain begins. The applause had stopped. The flashbulbs had stopped. 300 people were very quietly watching a man swipe cards in a ballroom. Someone in the back of the room said, not quite quietly enough, Isn't that the guy from the wedding video? Another voice. The one who called his mother-in-law a rat? Phones appeared. Not all at once. Gradually, the way phones always appear now when something shifts from event to incident. The wedding toast clip began playing in pockets of the room, small screens lighting up in the dim ballroom like a second parallel event running underneath the first. She owns the company, right? The bookkeeper lady. The MC leaned toward Derek and said something in his ear. Derek shook his head once, sharply. The MC stepped back. Derek stood at the podium for a moment. Just a moment, not long enough to be called hesitation, but long enough for everyone in the room to see that the man who always knew what to do next had for the first time run out of next. The house lights came up slightly. The music that had been playing softly underneath the event cut out. Derek stepped back from the podium. He walked off the stage. In my apartment in Harlem, I closed the live stream window, took a sip of wine, looked out at the city. I hadn't ruined the gala. I want to be precise about this. I had not engineered a public humiliation. I had simply declined to fund a performance. The humiliation had been in the architecture all along, built into every overpromised donor relationship, every leveraged reputation, every dollar Derek had spent on optics instead of substance. I had just let gravity do what gravity does when you build too high on a foundation of nothing. The structure had always been hollow. I had only stopped holding it up. Edward called the meeting. He sent the request through formal channels, a calendar invitation to a conference room on the 38th floor of the Whitfield Capital offices, 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. No assistants, no press, no agenda listed beyond. Family matter. In-person required. Derek and Savannah arrived together. Edward was already there when they walked in, sitting at the head of the table with a folder in front of him, and the specific stillness of a man who has decided that what he is about to do is necessary, even though it will cost him something. Derek sat down across from his uncle with the posture of a man who still believed this meeting would resolve in his favor. He'd convinced himself, I think, that the gala situation was a technical error, that the frozen transfers were a compliance issue, that the property situation in Brooklyn was a clerical mistake that would be unwound with the right attorney. He was wearing his second-best suit. I noticed this in the photograph Patricia's contact sent afterward. Not his best suit. His second best. As though some part of him already understood that this was a meeting where looking too polished would be a kind of lie he couldn't maintain. Savannah sat beside him. She hadn't slept by the look of it. She had dressed carefully anyway. Blazer, hair done, the performance of composure. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, very still, the way you hold your hands when you're afraid of what they'll do if you let them move. Edward opened the folder and placed the documents on the table. He didn't preface it. He didn't build to it. He had known both of these people for the better part of a decade, and he had watched Derek make one particular kind of mistake repeatedly, the mistake of assuming that the shape of a thing was the same as the substance of it, and he was done with preamble. He walked them through it. The Luxembourg intermediary, the capital agreement, the convertible note and its terms, the exercising of the conversion right, the controlling interest, the 12 holding companies, the property trust, all of it. Derek's face moved through several distinct expressions as Edward spoke. Skepticism, irritation, the beginning of the argument he was constructing internally, and then something that wasn't quite any of those things. Something quieter and harder. Savannah didn't move. She looked at the documents laid out in front of her. Her eyes moved down the page and stopped. She read a name. Hargrove, she said. The word came out carefully, the way you say something you need to hear in the air before you can believe it. She looked at her uncle-in-law. Hargrove Property Trust, she said again. Hargrove Strategic Partners. Edward nodded once. How long? She asked. And she was asking, I understood when Edward told me later, not how long had the investment been in place. She was asking how long had her mother been sitting with this, holding it, watching them, saying nothing. Since before the engagement, Edward said. She was the investor who saved the fund, Derek. 18 months before the wedding. You needed $4 million or you were closing. She provided it. You signed the agreement without reading it. You never asked who wrote the check. Derek's mouth opened. Then it closed. There was nothing to say. No version of this story in which he was not exactly what the document said he was. A man who had taken money from a woman he then publicly humiliated without ever knowing or caring who she was. Can we fix it? He asked finally, His voice was level. He was trying to be level. Edward looked at his nephew for a long time. "You had a silent partner," he said. "She stayed silent until you called her a rat in front of 300 people. This isn't something you fix, Derek. This is something you live with." Savannah stood up, her chair scraped back. She said, "I need a minute," and walked out of the conference room, and the sound of her footsteps in the hallway had a rhythm to it that I recognized when Edward described it to me later. The rhythm of someone walking away from the version of themselves they thought they were. Derek sat in the empty room with the folder open in front of him. Outside, New York went on. Indifferent. Alive. The eviction notice arrived by courier at 7:15 on a Thursday morning. Derek answered the door in the same terry cloth robe he'd worn the morning the demolition crew arrived, which told me something about the state of things in that apartment. The courier handed him a sealed envelope, asked for a signature on the confirmation slip, and left without making eye contact. Inside the envelope, a formal notice of lease termination for the Brooklyn townhouse, issued by Hargrove Property Trust, LLC, effective immediately, citing the expiration of the 30-day renovation period occupancy agreement that Derek's attorney had failed to identify buried in page 31 of the original 47-page acquisition document. The notice was 2 pages. It was written in the specific airless language of legal documents, language designed not to wound but to inform, which is sometimes worse. At the bottom, a single line. "Please arrange for the removal of personal belongings within 14 business days. A storage referral service is available upon request." Derek drove to the property management office. He did not call ahead. The woman at the front desk, whose name I later learned was Deborah, and who had worked in property management for 19 years and had seen every version of this particular conversation, looked at the notice he placed on her counter, looked at her computer screen, and said, "Yes, this appears to be in order. I own that house," Derek said. "You owned it," Deborah said. "As of last Thursday, ownership transferred to the trust. Your occupancy during the renovation period was structured as a leaseback arrangement. That arrangement has concluded." "That's not possible." "It's documented," Deborah said, and turned her monitor to show him. He called Savannah from the sidewalk outside. I don't know what he said. Edward didn't witness that call, and Savannah never told me directly, but I can imagine it. I've known Derek long enough by then to know how he sounds when the story he's been telling himself starts coming apart. Loud, certain, looking for someone else's name to put on the problem. Savannah called the number on the notice. Patricia's voicemail. She called again. Patricia's voicemail. She texted me. I read the text and set my phone face down on the kitchen table. Then I blocked the number. Quietly, the way I did everything. Not with anger, not with ceremony. Just a tap of a button and a door that closed without sound. They tried to manage it publicly, which was the only tool they had left. Savannah posted a photograph. Soft lit, carefully composed, both of them in the frame with moving boxes visible in the background. The caption, "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns. We're starting a new chapter. Growth looks different for everyone." She had borrowed my words. My exact words, almost. The ones I'd used when I walked out of the dinner with the fund liquidation documents. She'd taken them and tried to wear them as armor. The comments didn't allow it. Translation: Mom evicted you. "Growth looks different for everyone," she said while getting evicted by her own mother. "Bet the ugly rat owns the moving truck, too. Y'all really thought you were the main characters." They deleted the post within 3 hours. By then it had been screenshotted and redistributed enough times that deleting it was a purely cosmetic gesture. The digital equivalent of closing a window in a burning house. Derek's regulatory situation deteriorated that same week. A filing discrepancy, improper disclosure of the investor structure, misrepresentation of controlling interest in documents submitted to 2 institutional partners, had been flagged by an examiner at the SEC. This was not something I had engineered. This was the natural consequence of signing documents you haven't read, managed by attorneys you chose for their pedigree rather than their diligence. His fund manager license was suspended pending review. His lead attorney withdrew from representation, citing a conflict of interest he declined to specify. His watch sponsor, a Swiss luxury brand that had featured Derek in 2 print campaigns, quietly terminated the endorsement contract using a morality clause that, in the current climate, was very easy to invoke. The vendors from the wedding, meanwhile, had begun demanding payment. The reception had cost $112,000, a portion of which had been deferred pending reimbursement from the fund's entertainment and client relations budget. There would be no reimbursement. The catering company sent a formal demand letter. The florist, the same company that had delivered $9,000 of peonies to the estate driveway, filed a small claims notice. Derek and Savannah moved into a rental apartment in a suburb 40 minutes outside the city. Window unit air conditioners, a parking lot view, a landlord who required first, last, and security because their credit picture had become, in the language of property management, complicated. Savannah posted an Instagram story from the new place, blurry, unsteady, her voice stripped of its usual polish. We're just going through a transition. People change, priorities shift. She looked into the camera with the expression of someone who has rehearsed this, and then, at the last moment, forgotten why they were performing. The comments arrived within minutes. Mommy took her checkbook back. This is what happens when you build your whole brand on looking down at the woman who built you. The ugly rat won. She didn't respond. She didn't delete it either, which I thought was the most honest thing she'd done in 2 years. One by one, their social world contracted. Friends who had attended the wedding stopped responding to texts. Invitations to events they'd previously been fixtures at. Gallery openings, charity dinners, the quarterly gatherings of the financial set they'd worked so hard to enter, quietly stopped arriving. The collaborations Savannah had been building for her personal brand were canceled, one by one, in emails that used words like pausing and reassessing, and not the right fit for this moment. I didn't call. I didn't visit. I didn't send a message of any kind. I sat in my apartment and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not victory, not the warm vindication you imagine when you've spent years being diminished by people who should have known better. I felt clarity, the particular clean-edged clarity of a woman who has stopped carrying weight that was never hers, who has set it down finally and stood up straight and taken a full breath for the first time in longer than she can easily remember. They hadn't lost everything. I want to be precise about this. They had a place to live. They had each other, for whatever that was worth now. They had time, which is the one resource that can still be used if you're willing to be honest about what you've wasted. But they had lost the scaffolding. And I had learned, over 30 years of watching money move, that scaffolding is not a building. It is only what you put up while you're deciding whether to build something real. They had never built anything real. The scaffolding had always been mine. I bought the car at auction on a Friday afternoon in October. Derek's BMW, black, low mileage, leather interior the color of good coffee. It had been seized as part of the asset review process and listed in an online auction that I stumbled across while reviewing a property filing. The current bid was $3,800. I bid $4,000 and won within the hour. The license plate had been removed by then. It had read WFLDCEO. Derek had ordered it the year the fund first crossed 8 figures. He'd posted a photograph of himself leaning against the car with his arms crossed and a smile that said, "I built this." The post had gotten 12,000 likes. I didn't need the car. I have a perfectly adequate sedan that I've driven for 9 years, and that starts reliably in all weather, which is the only thing I require of a vehicle. But there was something in the idea of it, something I couldn't entirely articulate but didn't need to, that made me enter the bid without hesitating. Patricia thought I was being sentimental. "You're being sentimental," she said when I told her. "I'm being thorough," I said. I drove it for the first time on a Sunday, just a slow loop through the borough, windows down, the particular smell of an expensive car that has been recently cleaned by someone who doesn't own it. The seat adjusted to fit me. The engine made a sound like a very quiet, very confident statement. I drove past the house where Savannah had grown up, our house, the apartment building in Queens, 3rd floor, the window where I used to watch her walk home from school before she knew I was watching. I didn't stop. Then I drove, without particularly meaning to, toward the suburb where they were living now. I wasn't looking for anything. I told myself that. I was just driving. I had a full tank and a Sunday afternoon and a car I was learning the feel of, and the route happened to take me past their street. I turned onto it slowly. Their building was beige. 4 stories, window units on every floor, a parking lot with a broken security light. A laundry rack on their 2nd floor balcony with 2 dress shirts hanging in the October air like white flags. Savannah was outside. She was carrying groceries, paper bags, not the canvas totes with the French market print she'd been using the last few years. She was wearing jeans and flat shoes and a coat I recognized from 6 years ago, before Derek, before the fund, before any of this. She must have kept it in the back of a closet somewhere. She looked like herself in that coat. She looked like the person she'd been before she decided that person wasn't enough. She turned as my car slowed at the corner. She saw the car before she saw me. I watched her recognize it. Not the make or model, but specifically this car, the particular configuration of it. A small detail I hadn't considered. A scratch near the left rear taillight that Derek had made backing out of a parking garage 18 months ago and had been meaning to have repaired. She knew this car from the inside out. She knew every mile of it. Her face went through 3 different things in the span of 2 seconds. Then the window between us, me in the driver's seat, her on the sidewalk, made the last thing impossible to read clearly. She stepped off the curb. Her mouth opened. One of the paper bags slipped in her grip, and a handful of oranges rolled out and bounced off the curb and into the gutter, and she didn't look at them. I didn't stop the car. I didn't wave. Didn't smile. Didn't give her the confrontation she was reaching toward, or the reconciliation she might have also been reaching toward. I couldn't tell from behind the glass which one it was, and it didn't matter. I just drove past, smooth and slow and quiet. In the rear-view mirror, I watched her stand there, one bag still clutched against her chest, the other arm hanging, the oranges in the gutter, the dress shirts on the balcony above her, the broken security light in the parking lot. She got smaller and smaller as I drove. I turned at the end of the block and she disappeared. I drove home with the windows down and the heat on, the way I like it in October, the city coming back around me as I crossed back into the borough that has been mine for 30 years. I felt nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just the road and the engine and the particular completeness of a woman who has arrived, finally, exactly where she intended to be. The fund announcement went out on a Wednesday in November. A press release, 1 page, spare language, Patricia's firm listed as the point of contact. No photograph of me attached. No quotes. Just the facts. A new philanthropic fund, $1 million in initial capital, scholarship grants for first-generation women pursuing careers in finance, with preference given to daughters of immigrants, daughters of single mothers, daughters of women who had been told in one way or another to stay quiet and stay small and stay in the background. The name of the fund, the Ugly Rat Fund. Patricia had objected, predictably. "It's too personal," she said. "It invites a narrative you may not be able to control." "That's exactly why I chose it," I said. The logo I had commissioned from a young designer in the Bronx, a woman 23 years old who was working 2 jobs and saving for design school, and who had sent me a portfolio that made me sit back in my chair and look at it for a long time. A rat in pearls, standing on a pile of balance sheets, holding a pen. No crown, no claws, no dramatic pose, just calm and polished and holding a pen. It was exactly right. The applications opened on a Monday. By Friday, we had received 412 of them, not just from students. That was the thing I hadn't fully anticipated. The women who wrote to me who were 43, 51, 67 years old. Women who had spent decades being told they'd missed their window. Who read the name of the fund and understood, without anyone explaining it, what it meant, what it was made of. "I've been a bookkeeper for 28 years and I always thought it was too late to want more," one woman wrote. "You reminded me that what I know has value. I didn't think anyone could see that. My daughter told me last year that I don't understand the world anymore. I started questioning whether she was right. Now I'm not so sure she was. I've been waiting for someone to give me permission. I think I finally understand that's not how this works. I read every application myself." Patricia offered to hire a review committee. I told her I would review the first cohort personally. I needed to read their words. I needed to know who they were, not as applicants, not as demographics, but as the specific, irreplaceable women they were, the ones who had been running the numbers behind the scenes for decades while someone else took credit for the totals. I knew them. I was them. Patricia forwarded me a digital analytics report 3 weeks after the website launched. Traffic data, geographic distribution, device types. I scanned it until I found the line I was looking for. One IP address, in a suburb 40 minutes outside the city, had visited the fund's website 3 times in a single night. 11:47 p.m., 1:12 a.m., 2:59 a.m. The application page had been opened and closed without submission all 3 times. I read that line and set the report down. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt something older and quieter than either of those things. The feeling of a woman who has watched her daughter sit with something in the dark and not yet know what to do with it. She knew what the name meant. She had been at the wedding. She had heard it in that ballroom, bouncing off the walls, landing in the laughter of 300 people. She knew what the name was made of and who had made it and what it had cost. She visited 3 times. She didn't apply. That was hers to carry, not mine. The interview request came from Tom Daly, host of a podcast called Built From Here, a small, carefully produced show about entrepreneurs and operators who had built things outside the conventional path. Tom was 31, earnest, the kind of interviewer who actually read the material before he arrived. He'd found me through the fund announcement, done 2 weeks of research, and sent a request that was 4 paragraphs long and did not once use the word viral. I agreed to speak with him on one condition. We filmed at my kitchen table. Not a studio, not a conference room, not a borrowed space with soft lighting and a backdrop chosen to communicate authority. My kitchen table, with the chip on the right corner and the window that faces the courtyard where Savannah used to climb the lower branches of the tree. Tom arrived with a small camera crew, 2 people, quiet, professional. They set up in 40 minutes. Tom asked if I wanted to review talking points. No, I said. I know what I'm going to say. We rolled in 1 take. I looked into the camera the way I have learned to look at anything that matters. Directly, without performance, without the softening that women are taught to apply to themselves in public, so that the people watching feel comfortable. My name is Gloria Hargrove, I said. You might know me as the ugly rat. That's what my daughter's husband called me at their wedding, in front of 300 guests. In front of her, I let it sit there for a moment. Not for effect, because it deserved a moment. Because things that are true and painful deserve the space to be both those things without being immediately covered over. I smiled, I said. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt the way only your own child can hurt you. I smiled for a second, remembering it. I smiled because 3 days before that toast, I had already signed the papers giving me controlling interest in the company funding his lifestyle. And he had no idea. Tom was very still across the table. He had the good instinct not to interject. I spent 30 years being underestimated, I said. As a bookkeeper, as a widow, as a woman in rooms where the assumption was that I was there to take notes rather than to read them. I looked at my hands for a moment. The hands that had signed the documents, balanced the ledgers, resold the shoes, held Savannah's hand for 3 hours at her father's funeral. That's all right. That's how I learned. Every room I wasn't invited into taught me something about the room. Every time someone assumed I wasn't paying attention, I paid closer attention. I leaned forward slightly. I didn't raise my voice, I said. I raised capital. There's a difference. One asks for permission. The other doesn't need it. I let that land. To every woman watching who has been told she missed her window. She's too old, too quiet, too much of the background, not enough of the story. I looked straight into the lens. You don't need permission to hold power. You already have it. Learn where it lives. Learn how to move it quietly. And then move it. I sat back. Tom waited a beat in case there was more. There wasn't. That was everything. Is there anything else you'd like to add? He asked. I thought for a moment. Then I looked back at the camera one last time. Yes, I said. Thank you for sitting at my kitchen table. I stood. I walked out of frame. Tom told me later that he sat at that table for almost 2 minutes after I left before he remembered to call cut. The clip went up the following morning. 6.2 million views in 48 hours. The top comment, pinned by more than 100,000 likes. This isn't a comeback story. This is a coronation. The banquet was held on a Friday in December. We used the same ballroom, the same venue where Derek had stood at the podium with 3 declined cards while the wedding toast video played on phones throughout the room. I had rented it specifically, deliberately, not out of cruelty but out of accuracy, because some spaces need to be reclaimed, because a room that has held one meaning can be given another, and the giving is the point. No red carpet, no champagne display, no gold foil place cards or custom floral arrangements or lighting designed for maximum visual impact. String lights, warm and simple, round tables with white cloths, Folding chairs that we'd had the good sense not to apologize for. Women in blazers they'd pressed that morning, some of them secondhand, all of them earned. The first 10 scholarship recipients sat in the front row. One of them was 58 years old. She had spent her career as an administrative assistant at an accounting firm, watching CP. As she had trained perform work she understood better than they did, in meetings she had never been invited to sit in. She had submitted her application at 2 in the morning, she told me later, because she'd been afraid if she waited until daylight she'd lose her nerve. When I called her name, she walked to the stage carefully, like someone who wasn't entirely sure the ground would hold. Then she got there and she stood very straight, and she looked out at the room, and something in her face shifted. Quietly, privately, the way things shift when they are finally, after a long time, in the right place. I had to look away for a moment. Not from sadness, from the particular fullness of something you've built arriving at the moment it becomes real. I gave the speech I had been carrying in pieces for years without knowing it. I talked about balance sheets. I talked about the specific kind of silence that isn't weakness, but strategy. I talked about what it means to be erased, to be the background noise, the corner table, the woman handed a room key by the airport, and how erasure, when you refuse to accept it, becomes a kind of invisibility that you can use. They thought they had silenced the rat, I said, but I was building the maze they were walking through. The room laughed. Not the polished, cued laughter of a wedding reception, but the real kind. The kind that comes from recognition. I was near the end of the speech when I turned to gesture at the scholars behind me and saw her. Savannah, not on stage, not in the audience, standing behind the bar at the far end of the room, in black slacks and flat shoes, pouring wine for a table of guests. She had taken a job. I learned later she had taken several in the months since the fund collapsed. And tonight's assignment, dispatched by a hospitality staffing company whose clients included this venue, was working the banquet. She didn't know when she took the booking who had organized the event. She knew now. She was looking at me. She didn't look away when our eyes met. She held it, the way she'd held it that morning in my apartment. The direct look that meant she was done performing and was only herself, for better or worse. I held it for a moment. Then I turned back to the room and finished my speech. You don't need to announce yourself, I said. You don't need a seat at their table. Build your own table. Set it well. And invite the women who were told there wasn't room for them. The applause was real, the kind you can't manufacture. I handed out the awards one by one, calling each name slowly, making sure each woman had time to get to the stage and stand in the light without being rushed. Toward the end of the evening, I was sitting at my table, a small round one near the stage, nothing special, when Savannah passed by. She didn't look at me. She set a glass of sparkling water on the table in front of me. Careful, quiet. The glass placed without a sound, without ceremony, without any of the language she had been using for 2 years. The polished language, the managed language, the language of a woman performing a version of herself designed for an audience. Just a glass of water. Just her hands, which looked like mine, setting it down. I didn't say thank you. She didn't wait for it. She moved on to the next table, carrying her tray, doing her work. But I picked up the glass, and I drank. Because we were both in that room, my room tonight, the room I had built from 30 years of silence and patience and the specific, unglamorous work of a woman who never stopped paying attention, and the glass of water was the most honest thing that had passed between us in 2 years. No performance, no audience. Just water, offered quietly, by a woman who was beginning, perhaps, to understand what quiet is worth. I didn't know what would come next between us. I didn't know if the door had opened or only shifted slightly in its frame. I had learned over 30 years of reading financial documents and human beings with equal care not to mistake a gesture for a resolution. But I was not angry anymore. That was the thing I noticed, sitting at my table in a room full of women who had been told they were background noise and had chosen anyway to become the story. The anger was gone. What was left was something older and steadier. The feeling of a woman who has done the work, who has built the thing, who has looked at the room she is sitting in and understood, with the full weight of everything it took to get here, that it is hers. Not borrowed, not performed, not conditional on anyone's approval or anyone's invitation. Hers. Earned. Complete. I named the fund what they called me. I used their words as the foundation, because that's what bookkeepers do. We take what we're given and we make it balance. And in the end, it always balances.